Good morning, everybody. I've been thinking a lot about guilt and shame. They seem to me very, very powerful uh, feelings that motivate a lot of human behavior. And they seem pretty operative in the culture right now. They seem writ large. So, someone once suggested that the difference between guilt and shame is that guilt expresses the idea that you did something wrong, that little homunculus that's inside your forehead. You did something wrong. And it implies with it a kind of corrective. You know, you can still better yourself, you can still make things better, and that you are not without merit. This was an act of behavior, it was circumscribed. So it offers you the opportunity of behaving differently. Shame is much more devastating. The message of shame is that you yourself are flawed. It's kind of all-encompassing. I can remember as a child, I grew up in a household, Jewish household, that flourished on guilt. I had many Catholic friends, another religion that flourishes on guilt. And I can remember being overwhelmed by being shamed because some part of me felt that I was being misread, that there was more to me than what was being described. But at 6, at 7, at 8, I didn't really have the capacity to explain it, to explain myself. When my parents were cross with me, they would say very often, "Who do you think you are?" I found that question paralytic. I didn't know, which one of the menagerie to bring forward and say, well, this is me. It was me for an instant, and then there was another puppy or a kitten or something. Crazy little fat Jewish boy would pop up. I used to be really interested in insects, the minds, the lives, the practices of insects. And the ones that really fascinated me were hunter-killer wasps. Hunter-killer wasps, you can tell they have a almost hair-thin waist. There's a bulbous rear end, there's a kind of iridescent wings and front end. They're oftentimes a kind of iridescent blue. And what they do is they capture caterpillars to feed their larvae. And they make a kind of clay airplane hangar, a little tiny airplane hangar. And they drag a caterpillar in there and first they paralyze it by stinging every segment of its body. Then they drag it inside and then they chew off enough of its brain so it can't recover, but so that it won't die. Be interesting to know what evolutionary defeats were created by wasps that chewed too much brain away. And then they lay their egg on the caterpillar. And when the larva comes out, the larva excretes gastric juices and things which liquefy the caterpillar. And the larva can eat and become a wasp. Always seemed like a pretty grueling realm. Well, I think of guilt and shame as being relative to that. I think in terms of my growing up and my Jewish friends, we were all told very often that relatives, many people had died for us, how fortunate we were warm, we were well fed. It was indisputable, but it didn't seem like the best rationale for being forced to eat tongue or liver. Luckily, I had a dog, and I mastered the art of slipping liver to my dog. But it was always, think of the poor little starving kids in China. And there was this morality and ethical system that was just draped over you like a wet blanket. And I suppose it was teaching, teaching of a sort, but it seems pretty counterproductive. It implied that it did imply that it was our responsibility to be related to other people, which is something that is congruent with Buddhism. It did imply that we were responsible for our behavior, and by our behavior we could help people or we could harm people. It did that. But it was always accompanied by negative freight. You always felt like crap when you were told that you should feel guilty. It did not feel good. And when you were ashamed or told to feel shame, it was hopeless. It was like you were defective and there was no way that you could explain yourself. Well, I've been thinking about this in terms of kind of current practices, even within sanghas or within groups of people. There are both implied norms and there are people who assume that their norms are the norm that should be. And they don't hesitate to create mental architecture that will justify their norm and make people wrong by being outside of it or not participating in it. I'm sure we've all seen this in progressive politics. You can see the struggles that are going on between the progressives in Congress and the moderate Democrats in Congress and the conservative Democrats in Congress. Each one has a kind of mental architecture which ideally is responsive to their audience, their voters, may or may not be. But all the criticisms, all the attacks, everything comes with kind of passion and a great moral freight that just seems to paralyze things. I was watching the news this morning about the United States blunder. We recently sold some submarines to Australia, and we were in competition with French submarines, and the Australians chose the American submarines. They were atomic powered, they went longer, they were quieter, they had a lot of capacities. And we knew this was going to happen, and our politicians had been talking to French politicians and said nothing. Very close allies. And then when it came out, it looked as if, and the French accused us of stabbing them in the back. And it was an extraordinary breach of political protocol and diplomacy. They recalled their ambassador, the French, the first time in the history of the United States. The people that were responsible for us winning the Revolutionary War by sending General Lafayette, by sending ships, by sending money, giving Washington's troops bullets and food and uniforms. The first time in that length of history that they've recalled their ambassador. And the president, who I really admire, who I think has done a really good job, has been curiously defensive and explaining nothing, really. And so I'm looking from the highest office down to, a little kid that steals his sister's cookie. Or in my family, my sister stole my cookie. And she was impervious to shame. I just want to say that. But these things operate through our culture. And the place that I see it writ most large right now is in the issue of the assault on the Capitol, January 6th. In Buddhist practice, we say that this moment came from the moment that preceded it. And that moment came from the moment that preceded it. And so that everything exists in this moment is dependent on, grew from, evolved from what was immediately apparent. And for the last 4 or 5 months, I've been doing a lot of reading I've been interested about where the rage has come from in the United States, where 70 million people voted for a man who's one step above a felon, um, refusing to wear masks, refusing to get vaccines, allowing variants to grow, and doing it with great stubbornness and great rage and anger, and sometimes ripping the masks off people, getting in fights on airplanes. So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've suspected for a long time that guilt and shame were somewhere at the foot of it. So yesterday on my Facebook page, I posted 2 books that I'm gonna share with you. And I want to say that when I talk about politics like this, I'm talking about it from the standpoint of our responsibility to save all beings. One of the things that I've been trying to do is I've been trying to find some kind of compassionate address for the people who are refusing vaccinations, refusing masks. I've been trying to understand what's been going on. I've been doing a lot of research on vaccines. But the 2 most formative books I've read about the public sphere are these. One is called Winner Take All Politics by Hacker and Pearson. How Washington Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. And these guys are 2 brilliant chaired professors of economy, one at Berkeley, one at Princeton. And they began an exhaustive study on what accounts for the divide in inequity, which has become now as great as Saudi Arabia. So the difference between our wealthy and our poor is similar to what exists in the Emirates of Arabia. And they were exhaustive about it. They're scholars. And they studied education, they studied background, they studied psychology, they studied globalism, they studied computers, they studied everything. They couldn't find anything to account for it. Until finally, they stumbled on the fact that both political parties are funded by the 1/10 of 1%, the wealthiest people in the United States. The people who, even under the Biden plan to raise taxes on the wealthy, are being untouched. Jeff Bezos, Amazon, this one, that one, their fortunes, their repositories of great wealth are not being touched. Taxes are going up on the upper middle class, but not on these people. And we have to suspect that one reason is because the Congress is something like a wholly owned subsidiary of those people. In a political system which is organized around money, it probably shouldn't surprise us that the interests of money are always privileged over the interests of people. And that was something of a revelation to me. In order to stay in office, giving politicians every benefit of the doubt that they're actually there to serve, in order to successfully stay in office, they have to have enough money to mount advertising campaigns, to pay for extraordinarily expensive campaigns, to raise money for other people who'll be their allies and help them. And they get the money from the people who have it. President Obama raised 40% of his campaign costs from little nickel and dime donations. So did Bernie Sanders. But for President Obama, 60% of his funding came from Wall Street, hedge funds, derivative traders, the people who ruined the economy in 2008, not a one of whom went to jail, even though what they did, according to federal investigators, was patently illegal. So many of these things that they do are invisible to the people that were attacking the Capitol, because they're fiddles in legislation, they're fiddles in tax law, stuff that's invisible. You change the rate of capital gains. You change the rate of interest that can be charged on credit cards. All of these little things are kind of below the ken of people who are working sometimes 2 and 3 jobs and just barely making ends meet. But they know they're going backwards. Before I get into that further, I'll tell you the other book. The other book is called Evil Geniuses. It's by, I think his name is Alexander Kerr or Kearns. He was a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard, was an editor of Spy magazine, very, very fine writer. And he basically looked back 50 years to the beginning of the conservative revolution, which occurred at the end of the 60s. The 60s was so turbulent, thanks to lots of stuff, me and mine and the counterculture, the Black Panthers, the Vietnam War, social injustice, the women's movement, all sorts of issues, that people became kind of exhausted and a wave of nostalgia began. Groups like Sha Na Na came up doing 50s music, and culture hit a curious kind of freeze, so that by the 80s or the end of the 80s, he does a little exercise. You can't tell much between the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, whereas before, if you looked at the fashions of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, you could tell each one. So America hit a kind of freeze. And the evil geniuses, according to him, were these very clever people who slipped Ronald Reagan into the presidency disguised as an old folksy cowboy. Faded denim shirt, cowboy hat, good waspy jaw and smile, congeniality. And basically, they used that frozen moment, that nostalgia, to forward a whole bunch of ideas like real men don't need welfare, real men don't need unemployment, real men don't need the government to pay for their medicine. And they began basically unwinding Roosevelt's New Deal, began around 1970. And then early on, the Chamber of Commerce hired a soon-to-be Supreme Court justice named Lewis Powell and had him write a white paper on what the business community could do to fight back. And he wrote a very brilliant and detailed recipe for the business community, which was picked up wholesale by young millionaires, like the Koch brothers, like the Coors family, like Richard Scaife Mellon, like the Rensselaers. And he told them, fund think tanks, put television and radio studios in them, go to the colleges and give scholarships to bright young men and send them to Washington as interns, no strings attached. And they go to your school boards, go to your library board, go to become a member of the PTA. And the right wing did this in a very, very disciplined manner, and they basically moved America very, very far to the right. Ronald Reagan declared government the enemy, not the servant of the people. He fired 11,000 air traffic controllers. The corporate sector followed by declaring war on the unions. They attacked and weakened the National Labor Relations Board. They opened up right-to-work states all over the South. And they basically destroyed the wealth-producing mechanism of the middle class, which was the unions. When that happened, rich people began to flaunt their wealth. When I was growing up, the average wage of a CEO was about 40 to 60 times the wage of an average employee. And today it's about 700 times. So as they changed tax law, as both parties began to respond to Wall Street and financialization, remember it was Democrats, Bill Clinton, that made it illegal to control I can't remember the technical name, default swaps, credit default swaps, which created the housing bubble. It was Clinton that ended Glass-Steagall, which prevented insurance companies and banks from speculating with your money. So from 1970 onward, there was a massive shift of wealth from the wealthy, from the middle classes and lower classes to the wealthy. Wages were the same in 1973 until about last year in actual buying power. So I started thinking, what are the effects on people? We can see the crude effects. We can see the opioid scandal. We can see the crystal meth scandals. We can see that there are no beds in rehabs. We can see that GATT and NAFTA shipped millions and millions of wages out overseas, and no training money or very little training money was afforded American workers. And they've been devastated. And we can see the big picture. But when you get down to the small picture, I suspect it has a great deal to do with guilt and shame, because they can't actually see what was done to them. When Jimmy Carter was president, his Federal Reserve chairman, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates 5 points in a single day. And they bankrupted hundreds of thousands of small family farmers who had taken the advice of the ag agencies and the Department of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who said, get big or get out. They went into debt. They said, your grandparents didn't know this, but your land values are rising. You don't have to worry about this. Go into debt, buy big machinery, and farm fence row to fence row. And they did. And then in one swoop, they were bankrupted. They didn't know what hit them. For every 5 farms that closed, a business closed in the Middle West. So you lost the high school principal, or you lost the FFA coach, or the Boy Scout, or the basketball coach, or the hardware store. And the leading cause of death on the family farm became suicide. And that's what got me thinking about it. Because certainly farmers are not like urban people who lose an apartment, you get another apartment. I grew up on a farm. I grew up with a lot of farm people. And farmers receive the legacy of their entire family history. They're given the responsibility of a piece of land that may have been in their family for decades. And they lost it, and they don't exactly know how or what they did. And now most of those people are working on their own land for huge agricultural corporations. So agriculture policy denuded these people, stripped these people. Bill Clinton cut the budget on rural mental health. The only people who stood up for the farmers were the militias, curiously enough. Guys who copy little red copies of the Constitution in their pockets, and deal in silver money, and they want to shoot anybody who took an oath to the federal government. And they explain to these people, it's not your fault. It's Rockefeller, it's Bush and the black helicopters, it's the Jews, it's the Queen of England. They tried to take the burden of guilt and shame off them. But in fact, the guilt and shame is what's being suppressed by the opioid epidemic and the crystal meth epidemic. And you can take the same dynamic for people who worked for 35 years in an automobile factory, or they were working in a milling factory, or they were doing some work. And when I was a boy, my father could go to work, my mother could stay home, and on his wages, he could put kids through college. That sand all shifted, all the principles that people grew up with. And they were completely vulnerable to guilt and shame, because if you can't see it, you're told every day that America's a land of opportunity. And if you can't take advantage of the opportunity, how can you be at least free of guilt? Well, God, other people are getting rich. People are coming from India, black people who were suppressed for years. They're getting rich, and I'm still out here waiting for the American dream. And if it goes far enough, it becomes shaming. And so what do you do when you're ashamed? Well, one thing you do is you project outward on an enemy. And my deepest feeling, my deepest intuition from reading for the last 10 years on this subject is that The people in the Midwest, the farmers, the people in the closed factories, every day they got up, they had coffee, they watched the news. And they watched people with good hair and good suits laughing and chuckling together and talking about this one and talking about this issue and that issue. And none of it had anything to do with them. And they were just going downhill. So by the time Donald Trump came along, I think shame and guilt just decided to jam the works. If you remember, Trump campaigned on Bernie Sanders' language. He gave a populist, we're going to take care of you, don't worry. And people stopped trusting elites. I think it started, in my lifetime anyway, with the Kennedy assassination, where there were a lot of questions, legitimate questions, that were never answered by the Warren Commission. That was compounded at 9/11, when the 9/11 Commission asked questions, legitimate questions that couldn't be answered. And a whole slew of documentaries came out at that time, which spawned conspiracy thinking because the facts were not answered. Because the central fact is that our system is not designed to take care of people. Our system's designed to take care of and protect money. And one of the ways that we disguise the fact that it's set up to do that is we put the blame on the individual. We say, if you haven't made it, you've lost. It's your fault somehow. So then that leads me to wonder, so what's my responsibility and what can I do to counter blame and loss? How can I help people? If I'm correct, if this anger is indeed generated largely by shame, which is unbearable. It's unbearable to think that your life is completely worthless, that you are defective, this little idea of a self. If you're a Buddhist, you have some space because you know yourself is just an awareness, and you know you have bad habits maybe, but they can be changed. But you can't even grab your essence, so who can describe it? You're a little immune. But for people who grow up in a Judeo-Christian, Islamic tradition, Abrahamic religions, which are religions based on contradiction, good and evil, right and wrong, they're in trouble. They have a soul, and if that soul is shamed and told it's defective, it really hurts. And it hurts enough, I think, that people violated every norm. I mean, it takes a lot to pee in the Capitol, to break in, to pee on someone's desk, to violate someone's desk. This is rage. It's not just that they thought the election was stolen. That rage has been there for decades. So what can we do? That's always what I want to know. What can we do? So we teach meditation. We try to help people learn that their thoughts are evanescent, that they'll come and they'll go, and you can contain them, and you don't have to act in self-destructive ways. You don't have to gamble. You don't have to drink. You don't have to take drugs. You don't have to have illicit sexual affairs. You can contain what's unpleasant and painful. And you can then, if you choose, you can model a Buddha's life by the Eightfold Path. But I think another thing that we can do is to actually learn how our system works and be able to express it kind of without judgment or blame, just clearly explain to people how it works. We don't teach civics in school anymore. And when we do, we don't teach how it works. We don't teach the influence of money. We teach ideology, we teach structure, we teach ideas. Right now, for the last couple months, I've been reading the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison. And they were a series of anonymous articles published in New York. I think there are 88 of them, trying to get New York to support the Constitution of the United States. And they were making the argument that collectively, America was much stronger and safer against discord and rivalries and jealousy. And these men were extremely well educated. They could cite Roman history, Greek history. They could cite warfare all over the world. And their argument was that people are vindictive, jealous, greedy. It sounded like a shopping list of Buddhists, greed, hate, and delusion. And that if the states were not together, they would eventually begin warring over property. And they named many suits. Connecticut was suing Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. This one was suing that one. So these guys put together a system based on a very, very careful study of the world. But somehow political parties got into it, and partisan identity, and also wealth was built in at the beginning. You couldn't vote if you didn't own property. You couldn't vote if you were a woman. You certainly couldn't vote if you were a slave. And while we've been patient as a people, trying decade after decade for a more perfect union, somebody's ox is always getting gored. Somebody's always running out of patience. It's interesting to me that the people who are at the bottom end of the caste system, African Americans, when they chose to fight back, they dressed like they were going to church. They practiced absolute discipline. The only time they raised their voices was when they were in song. And those people were contrasted against crowds of people with ball bats screaming, frothing at the mouth. And it drew a line in the sand in America when I was growing up in the 50s. It was pretty clear which side of the line I was going to be on. But now white people who feel themselves slipping. There's a wonderful book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, where she explains that black people have traditionally played the lowest caste in America. And like caste systems all around the world, they're all the same. A low caste Indian has to walk 100 yards behind a Brahmin. They can't swim in the same pool. And now what's happening is that if you're one of these non-college educated white people, you've been standing in line for 50, 60 years for the American dream. It's just over the next hill there. Suddenly, black people are cutting in front of you, and Mexicans are coming in, and Indonesians are coming in, and you're slipping farther and farther back. And one of the things that a lot of these people voted for Trump for was that he would protect their whiteness. He might pick their pocket, but they would still have white privilege. And I think that people who are afflicted by guilt and shame can't really see beyond that. So to me, this is my abiding preoccupation right now. How to address this, how to talk about it in ways that people can understand it. And the best way that I've come up with is to clarify how our political system actually works, how it's paid for, who profits, how if the giving of money is free speech, some people have a lot more speech than others. So my soapbox has to compete with Fox News. I don't think that's what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. So little by little, all the institutions of America have coalesced around protecting money and power. And we have the ballot box. That's it. And now they're trying, of course, to suppress voting and control balloting. So it's a deep, profound time to be alive. And I guess each of us is going to have to make up our minds what we're going to do. But to me, there's no dividing line between Buddhist practice and political action. Buddhists may do political action differently. We're not going to scream. We're not going to make enemies of other people. We're going to try not to make people wrong, but we are going to stand for what we believe and model compassionate, calm, dignified behavior. So my dogs are whining and yelling. I don't know what's happening. So maybe that's enough. This is kind of a challenge, I think this is the central problem of Buddhism right now, is how we're going to relate to the culture that we live in and how we're going to find the means to be helpful and of use to people. If you have ideas, please tell me. Anyway, may all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. May all beings be filled with loving kindness. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and at peace. Maybe I'll be cheerier next time. Thank you for coming.